Hello and welcome to our April version of the GDTA Spotlight. My name is Uli Weinberg, and for those of you who were the first time, I'm the founding director of the School of Design Thinking in Potsdam in Germany, and I also started the Global Design Thinking Alliance. And the Global Design Thinking Alliance is actually an alliance of an association of now 36 institutions all around the planet in 23 countries who are all dealing with design thinking, doing design thinking training, design thinking research, design thinking education, and further on developing design thinking on a global scale. And it's up and running since 7 years now. And it does once a year a 2-day conference, which will happen this year, first time in Potsdam in Germany. It was at Penn State last year and in Cape Town the year before. And we do a monthly chat. And the monthly chat is the Spotlight, the GDTA Spotlight session, and it's a 1-hour session, and we have always special guests, and today we have a very special guest. Actually, it's the second time that Jeanne Liedtka, professor at the University of Virginia's Darden Graduate School of Business, is here partnering with us, and she is also a member with her institute, a member of the GDTA since quite a while, and we are very happy about that. And Jeanne is she's sitting in her office and she has tough timing because it's early in the morning and she came from a meeting and she's now doing the GDTA Spotlight, and after that she has another meeting. And I'm really happy that you're taking the time to tell us something about your latest book. You know, you are one of the persons on the planet who are very, very well known in the design thinking community for your books, and you are writing a lot. You're doing a lot of research in design thinking. You're working together with large companies, and you did through the past years an incredible support for the whole design thinking community with your research. And I hope that you get the chance in September to join our conference also in Potsdam, but we'll talk about that later. But now, your latest book was about experimentation, and it's a field book, a step-by-step project guide, and it's co-authored with Natalie Foley, with David Kester and Elizabeth Chen. And it was recently published, and I hope it's doing well. I haven't seen it here in Germany on the shelves, but you can order it. Mm-hmm. And I'm now happy to welcome Jeanne and give her the stage for our GDTA Spotlight session. And please welcome Jeanne.
It's wonderful to be here. Greetings from Charlottesville, Virginia. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this new work that we're doing in experimentation. Let's see if I can get my slides up here. Let's see, can everybody see the slideshow? Good. All right. Perfect. Great. Well, you know, I have spent the last, I don't know, 15 years at least on design thinking, and really thinking about this notion of the design thinking process. We've all talked about it so much, and you know, this is the language we use to talk about it at Darden. Everyone has their own language. It's all very meaningful. But I think what always has troubled me with my students over the last 15 years, as I've tried to teach these tools to, in particular, MBA students and managers, working managers, physicians, engineers, people not trained as designers. I've always enjoyed so much the rich front end of design tools. So if you think of during the early exploratory stages of design thinking, all of the amazing tools that we have, journey mapping, job to be done, personas, you know, just really, really great. And then I have felt for years as though I get to the testing portion of design thinking and I say, now go do some prototyping and design an experiment, right? As though the students had any idea what that really meant. right? But I felt like I didn't really have a systematic way of teaching it or a way to really guide them through the process. Over time, I think this question of the experimental back end has gotten more and more important. Because if we look beyond design thinking and we look to some, the other popular methodologies out there like agile software development or lean startup, these are also all based on experimentation. I mean, I think my belief, at least, is as we try and prepare students for success in what is obviously an increasingly uncertain and ambiguous world, teaching them fundamental skills in experimentation become really, really critical. And I feel, at least in the MBA curriculum, that this has been a very, underdeveloped area of teaching methodology. And so I really set out on this one very much from the perspective of, can we begin to codify and structure a way to help students get better at doing experimentation? And in particular here, we're talking about early stage experimentation. One of the things that traditionally has happened in business is people associate experimentation with research and development. They associate it with fairly sophisticated, A/B testing and various control group testing. And what we were really talking about is working with people very early in the idea stage and in very simple, fast tests, get them good at essentially hypothesis testing. That's what we're talking about. So our approach was much the same as it was with design thinking in the beginning. We just watched people do it who were very good. So we spent quite a bit of time in organizations and working with a set of consulting firms that were doing a lot of this early stage experimentation and just trying to track what they did and then think about how we could create a set of teaching tools that would allow students to kind of do what the experts were doing almost intuitively, in a way that was replicable and scalable and really teachable. So that's what I really have to report on today. And so what I'm focusing in on is really this testing notion, what we've called what wows and what works, which is really prototyping and experimentation. So having said that, we spent a lot of time looking at people who did experimentation well at early stage and badly. And we observed a very common set of mistakes that were going on, none of which are really surprising, but all of which really get in the way of successful experimentation. The first one is people were trying to test products, right? Products divorced from value propositions and audiences. And of course, you can't test an idea for a product. You have to test an idea for a product and the value it creates with a specific market. So we began to realize that very early on, people needed help framing testable hypotheses, right? Very basic ways. The second thing we found is, not surprisingly, they pretty much tried to use the data they already had rather than in a true hypothesis-driven way, trying to figure out the data they actually needed to conduct the test, and then thinking creatively about how to find that data. And I think this is one of the misnomers of experimentation. We often think that creativity is what happens in the front end of the process of design thinking when we're generating ideas. But in my experience, designing experiments, identifying data sources, these are very creative acts, right? And they take a lot of thought. And so this idea of helping people to think more systematically about what data would you need and how might you find that. We also found people consistently selecting the wrong type of tests, and associated with that, building prototypes with much higher fidelity than was needed. I mean, I think that would be kind of our general comment, that when people do try and experiment, they get way too sophisticated too fast, right? They come up with more complex experiments, and they start to talk about minimum viable product. And part of our notion here was early prototypes should be far simpler than minimum viable product. So how do we help people think about the appropriate level of fidelity for a prototype as they go into this process? And then finally, we saw lots of bad execution, not surprisingly. poor documentation and recording of data, people getting results but not really integrating them into a plan for how to iterate the concepts, and in particular, really not thinking about experimentation as a conversation with people who you're trying to get to change their minds about something, right? And particularly when you're getting experimental results that are not what people expect, how do you tell the story that helps people follow you and find your data compelling and agree to make those changes? So we set out to try and figure out how we would build a structure that would help us deal with these common problems in a simple way. With this group, I don't need to go into all the advantage of experimentation. Basically, it's a risk management device, right? It encourages you to start with a portfolio rather than a single idea, which I think is a concept that many people in management really struggle with. The idea that, you know, we don't have one best idea and we move that into testing, but instead we have a group of ideas and we let users tell us which ones work for them. So the portfolio dimension of it is, I think, really important, as well as just, you know, getting people out of arguments in the conference rooms, right? Actually, experimentation insists that people engage with real users, right? And that's such a powerful force in a world where, you know, we'll sit forever in the conference room and debate with each other with whatever database we happen to have. The whole experimental process, with its emphasis on hypothesis testing, can really break the paralysis, I think, of convincing people to move forward. So yeah, and essentially, basic idea, you know, we're trying to keep our investment and our costs, our risks in line, right? So when risks are high, when we're new and we don't know a lot, we're trying to do fast, quick experiments. And then we're willing to double down and improve our investment as we learn more and we test for more sophisticated aspects of a product. So essentially, we have distilled this process that we teach with down into 5 pretty obvious steps that we've structured around, first, helping people to frame ideas, right? And make sure that the idea they've got is testable. Then to define the evidence they really need and give some thought to the different types of evidence and what's needed. To select the test at particular stages in time that are right for where they are in the development of that idea, and given the resources they've got, to build the right kind of prototype, and then finally to kind of complete that cycle of executing, analyzing, iterating, and moving forward. So beneath each of those, like framing testable ideas, basically we've broken it down to a series of steps and created some guidelines to help people figure out how to capture this in a system way. You know, for any of you familiar with my design thinking work, I'm kind of obsessed with templates. I will own that, right? I find that templates, particularly when you're teaching virtually, which I increasingly am, templates offer a wonderful vehicle for me to engage with students with where they are and give them very concrete feedback. And also, they're a terrific mechanism for peer review. So we're using a lot of peer review in these classes that we're teaching these days. And I'll show you an example of some of the rubric we've created at the end for helping students give each other feedback. But that's really come to be an important part of the learning process. So we've done some pretty traditional work about things like prioritizing concepts for testing and helping people think about, you know, the value delivered, ease of difficulty graph and things that we would normally use. But we've also created what we're calling a concept snapshot. This is an example of a concept snapshot, very simple, for a Nike project that we studied that was called Easy Kicks. And Easy Kicks, Nike had decided they wanted to branch more into the service area. And so they had an idea for a subscription service. Sharon, you're finding this humorous. That's funny. For a subscription service for parents of young children who are tired of going to the food store, I mean, to the shoe store with them. And so they were clearly had a target user, which was both the young athlete and their parents. they had a specific notion of what they believed the unmet needs were, specified what they believed the benefits were, and then talked a little bit about what uniquely differentiated this idea from what was already available on the market. So again, very simple template. Who's this for? Who are you targeting? What is it that you're trying to deliver to them in terms of meeting unmet needs? What are the benefits you expect to provide, and why are you different than everything that's already there? Again, something that to us would be extremely obvious, but is very helpful to people beginning this experimentation process. And this is a point where you can help people to see that narrower targets are better as you move into experimentation than broader targets. So for instance, you can say Nike, why aren't they targeting the traditional Nike athlete to see if this would work, right? And the experimenters would argue very important to refine your value proposition to the dedicated group you're really interested in before you move on, and then you expand to the larger group, right? And this is kind of the model that we've used for growth in design thinking that has always been fascinating to me. As trained as a strategist, you start with an abstract idea that you think you can sell to as many people as possible, and then you translate it into more and more defined ideas. Whereas in design thinking and in this form of experimentation, we start with this very specific target market, we hone a value proposition to them, and then we ask whether that value proposition can be generalized to a larger group, right? So this is very helpful for demonstrating that. And again, we introduce the basics of storyboards so that people can begin to flesh out their idea into a customer experience, right? And a lot of this early testing work is helping people to take what is often a vague and abstract idea, translate it into a more definable customer experience and value proposition as a first step before we move into testing. Because when we get to defining evidence, what we know is we are really in the early stages testing assumptions, not the thing itself. Probably this is probably one of the teaching points that students struggle most in the classroom. They think testing is testing the thing, right? So you should build a minimum viable product close to the thing as you can get, and you should test the whole thing. When, of course, quick and inexpensive experimentation is almost always about testing a set of assumptions first, ideally that do not require you to build the whole thing, right? And so this idea of surfacing assumptions, and, in design thinking, we would talk about the traditional categories of, how is this creating value? Is it feasible? Is it sustainable, right? The kind of big three of assumptions, and then prioritizing which assumptions need to be tested first. And again, introducing this kind of idea of make or break assumptions. I mean, oftentimes students, clients, people want to go out and test all their assumptions at once, when in fact, there's usually just a handful of assumptions that if they are not true, basically makes the idea not worth testing further. Right. So a lot of this early stage of step 2, before we define the evidence we need, we have to define the critical make or break assumptions that are immediately what we're going to test and what would constitute evidence that would give us the foundation for making judgments on that. So we introduce language around assumptions, evidence, hypothesis, and then some notion of threshold targets. Right? Once we've decided what evidence is, how do you set a target so that you know when you conduct the experiment whether or not that means yes, move forward, no, iterate, or abandon even the idea? And again, I think this idea of forcing people to be specific about what success looks like in advance, even if there isn't firm data. I think one of the things that's always interesting with students as we go into experimentation is this notion that we're basically looking for directional support at the early stage, right? We can't prove anything as a good idea at the early stages, right? We can't generalize it to larger audiences, but what we're trying to do is say, for this particular audience, this is what we think will happen. And generally, this seems to be what's happening, which gives us the motivation to move to the next step, right? So that's kind of a mentality of experimentation that I think comes more difficult to some than others. We've actually played with this idea of giving students this kind of Mad Lib to help them figure out how to write out some critical assumptions. It's often surprisingly difficult to get them to really unpack the assumptions. And then here, again, very simple template that we're using here as an example of Southwest Rail out of London, some of the work that David Kester's group has done around how to improve customer service. Some new ideas that they have for improving customer service called the concierge concept, right? Helping students to see, let's lay out some critical assumptions, which in this case have to do with both improving the experience of customers and improving the experience of employees. And then let's talk about what we'd have to see and count in some ways to know that there was evidence to support our assumption that this would create the sense of a warm welcome, right? And then let's talk about how we get it. Is it observations? Is it customer interviews? Is it sales data, for instance? Right? Is it interviews with staff? Just to begin to get very concrete and build that building block of it. As we move into selecting your test, we've created what is really a decision flow here and asked people to consider a set of questions. The first question has to do with whether you are ready to move into the market or whether you already have existing data that would allow you to test an assumption, right? Again, students often want to go immediately to the market, but in fact, the fastest, cheapest way to test an assumption is with data you've already got, if you've got the right data. Right. So once you've laid the foundation for identifying what's the right data, the first question is, do you already have that data? Does it exist somewhere? In which case you can conduct what we think of as a thought experiment using that data without actually entering the market. If not, and frequently when we look at the value assumptions for a new product or service, you don't have the data, right? So we're moving into the market. Right? And then we're thinking, I think, at a very specific level of, do you have to test the whole idea or can you test just a component of the idea first? And under certain circumstances, for instance, with the Nike example, it was a pretty complex value proposition, which included both sustainability issues like people recycling the shoes, as well as ease of use issues about parents with the subscription service. So they decoupled those two. And the first thing they teed up was, would people, in fact, mail their shoes back to Nike for recycling? Right? So they tested that because in Nike's view, the recyclability component was very important to them. And they were much less interested in a subscription service in which they couldn't deploy recycling of the shoes, right? They'd made a big investment in equipment that would recycle old sneakers. So in those cases, we'd pull out a component and test that first. In other cases, for instance, the Southwest Rail concierge concept, it was easier to test the whole concept at the same time. And again, we tried to give people a set of conditions to look for to make that decision. Right? Having made the component whole decision, then you go into the say data versus do data. Probably the most important decision point with any experiment you're designing. Is it good enough to ask people what they want? Or do you need to actually engineer an experiment where people have to behave and demonstrate through their behavior that they want what they want? And of course, depending upon the stage of the idea and some other factors, the answer to those would point you in the direction of a series of different experimental designs, ranging from very simple cognitive walkthroughs with rough storyboards, right through to pretty sophisticated trials with minimum viable products that had functionality. And helping students make that decision about where that falls, at this particular stage, is a goal that we've had with kind of this work. Then we get to prototyping. Well, we know it's all about format and fidelity there. And again, trying to be clear about what are some of the different kinds of prototypes, helping students to understand that things like storyboards and posters are low fidelity prototypes and very valuable, right? That minimum viable product is actually at the end of the range of prototypes. It's not the only format for prototyping. And then building in some aids about thinking about form, function, and interactivity, and the level of fidelity you need for each of those, and which particular types of prototypes might be useful, given, again, where you are in the process. And then finally, the set of activities associated with actually doing the experiment, testing it, auditing it, running the data, thinking about storytelling and sharing your findings, and then, of course, designing the next test and what that looks like. So really, through all of these stages, we've mostly just tried to be explicit and lay out a set of patterns. So for instance, in the Nike case, to just give people a little bit more detail on what this actually looks like. So they're testing that people are willing to return their old shoes, right? This is the first stage. And they're using a test methodology called lemonade stands to do that, right? So they're setting up stands in existing Nike stores. They're asking people to return their old shoes, and they're trying to understand why they're returning their old shoes, right? For what's motivating their return of the old shoes, right? After that, having learned that, they move into more of a minimum viable experience where they're doing a lot of smoke tests online, right? Which is they're asking people to click a link or something, so they're beginning to get some behavioral evidence, right? In a crude way, and then eventually they're building a higher fidelity prototype to test and scale, and really running a large scale trial with that, with the end result being that they iterate along the way, and they actually do end up introducing this venture. It's called the Nike Adventure Club, and it's the result of these kind of experiments that they do. So this whole idea of a project flow, this is from a different project that we studied, which is the Project Management Institute, which is probably the largest certifier of project managers in the world. It's a member organization looking to improve the quality of memberships. And again, just kind of capturing their movement from walkthroughs and interviewing to lemonade stands to LinkedIn ads and smoke tests, and then eventually into simulations and trials to again get this pattern of what it all looks like. So here is some of the teaching material that we've started to design around it. So how do we create course materials that make it easier for us to do this? Now, the bulk of our courses that we started to offer around here are project-based, and students bring their own projects. So we have some cases that we're currently finishing up now that would allow you to teach this in the absence of an individual student project. And there are, of course, some real advantages to using a common case for a whole class as a practice run to actually then applying that to their project. I mean, it's the same way we've tended to teach design thinking over the years. But as I said, an important part of this has been working with students to train them to give good feedback to each other. Because again, our experience has been that they learn as much from providing feedback to another student on their work as they learn from preparing their own work and getting feedback from the instructor on it, right? So here we've just created this rubric based on that concept snapshot I showed you, that very first kind of template, which is, what's your concept? Who are you targeting? What needs are you meeting? What are the offerings? What are the benefits? Why is it unique? And then just trying to giving students some clues as to how to assess quality. Does the concept name really capture the essence of the concept quickly? Are they giving you specific user targets that you can actually find in order to do tests with, right? Are the needs that they're listing, are they specific enough and insightful enough to be worth testing? Right. So again, we found that building out the rubrics for the templates, so that we not only have the template, we've done some thinking on how to give each other feedback in the class about what makes a good answer here, really has gone a long way in making in creating more interaction among students in the class, as well as helping them to take the work more seriously in their comments to each other. So again, that's the heart of it. This is another template where it's just a progress tracker that kind of steps people through and first asks, do we have a clear understanding of what we're testing? That is, we've framed a testable hypothesis, we've defined the evidence. Do we have a clear understanding of how we're testing it? Have we selected the right test and the right prototype? And then finally, what are we learning from the test? And are we capturing that learning? Are we using it to tell a compelling story to other people about what's happening? So again, I think for those who are well-versed in experimentation or kind of intuitively good at this, there's not much here that isn't pretty obvious, right? But we've found that the whole codification of it really helps us as we try and take what's often kind of a murky area and help students understand it. So that is my very quick overview of kind of the process and what's in the book and how we're working with it and trying to translate it into a set of teaching materials. So love to just talk about it for a bit, hear your questions, hear your reactions, what seems to you to make sense and what doesn't. What could be helpful to you as you think about an interest you may have in using some of these materials with your students. Really, the floor is open and I'm kind of at your service. I have the chat up, or I think we can just unmute ourselves and jump in if that, or Uli, if you'd like to kind of coordinate a discussion, whatever really works best.
Yes. So yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Jeanne, and a big applause for your input here. And I would like to ask all of you who want to be a part of the discussion here to switch on your video. We always love to see the people in the video. We encourage you also to switch on your microphone. You can use you can raise your hands here, your virtual hand, but you can just, hopefully we can see that. Let me just change my view, and I get a chance to see all of you. Yep. And since Zoom allows to see all of the 45 participants, and we have Selina with the first question.
Yeah,
Hi, Selina.
Thank you so much. Hi, I hope you can all hear me. Yeah, thank you very much. It was so interesting to hear about your new book. I wonder if you have any examples from a leadership perspective where experimentation is used not so much maybe for products or new services, but rather on a strategic level. Because I started to talk about experimentation and maybe more about iteration or like small feedback loops with executives. And I found it very interesting because sometimes they come from a very different mindset just because that's what was taught to them like 20 years ago. And yeah, we used experimentation often as a conversation starter about smaller cycles also in higher level management practice. And I was wondering what your experience is on that and if you have any insights.
I mean, I think that's a fascinating question, Selina. My first love was strategy. And so one of the things I've often wanted to do, but have not yet done, is to try and much more explicitly tie both design thinking at the front end and experimentation into the strategy making process. And if you think about it, there is nothing more, to me, the opposite of what we talk about with design thinking and experimentation than most organizations' strategic planning process. Right? I mean, it just has so many misconceptions. It starts with the organization's needs and competencies and considers, customers as a second. How do we take what we already are good at and convince people they need it? And on the experimentation side, it starts with this premise that we can predict the future and identify what particular set of products or services are going to be part of our growth strategy and move forward. Right? And I think both of those assumptions are so flawed. If you really wanted to help managers manage strategically, you would help them to understand that they need to manage a portfolio of bets, which we understand. In an uncertain world, we're not sure which of them, like a venture capitalist, they manage a portfolio of ideas. and they experiment, and the ones that work, they invest further in, and the ones that don't work, they shut down. But I don't know of a single strategic planning process. And I've spent a lot of time looking for some examples of this that actually does that. You know, as an academic, I have to find somebody doing it right before you can like do research on them. I mean, this is our dilemma. You know, we can talk theoretically about what we want everything to look like, but in the end, you can't write an academic paper or book based on what you think people ought to do. You have to actually find some evidence that people are doing it and it's working. And I've just been struggling to find the right companies. I had a long conversation with Roger Martin the other day. Because I think of anyone, Roger he was a strategist by training, right? He really inaugurated in the business where a lot of our thinking about design thinking, worked extensively with people like Procter & Gamble to try and bring that way of thinking in. So I thought, wow, if anybody knows companies that are doing this, it'll be Roger, right? And and not so much could he come up with a list. Now, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways that he's working to enlighten people on their ideas of strategy and how they think about strategy and what goes into it. But at a tactical level, the kind of stuff that we're interested in, how do you actually build an experimentation model into a corporate strategic planning process? There's just not been much out there at all. So, you know, I think you've put your finger on an incredible opportunity. We just need to find some organizations actually doing some interesting things so that we can tell their stories and study what they're doing and its outcomes and begin to change that model of planning from this kind of stale thing that exists now to something that's alive and generative and experimental and really reflects the reality of what managers who are successful actually have to do in their world. But I wish I had a more satisfactory answer than that. But that's where I am. And it's one I've thought a lot about because I would love to think about how to make some really good progress on that. It could be huge.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that reminds me, Jeanne, what you're talking about, finding the companies. Maybe SAP is an interesting company to look at because it's as a software company, they used to do what you were talking about at the beginning, that they were just defining a certain area to work in, and then they had 20 teams to follow up for 2 years to work writing software. They didn't do prototypes. They didn't do experimentation. It was about 12, 13 years ago, and it was completely new for them to think in a more iterative way and then do prototypes. And their way of doing prototypes was writing code. It was already way too far. And then we asked them to, in our first workshops, design thinking workshops, we asked them to do prototypes with Post-it notes and with carton boards, with paper. And they were saying, no, we can't do that. We are professionals, you know, our clients will laugh at us. But right now, after lots of years, several years now, they don't do that anymore. But they were shooting in so many directions for several years and spending a lot of money for nothing. Because of course, like in the venture capital process, out of 10 projects, only 2 survived. Yeah. And if you ask the people in the team, in the teams, they were saying, oh, our project will die, but we are paid anyway, so we continue working on that. Wow. So because the process was set up like for 2 years they had to work, you know, even if they knew it was not working. So but Flavia is directing our professional training at the HPI, the D School. So you have a lot of experience with companies. Maybe you have another idea besides SAP.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very insightful spotlight. My question goes a bit also into the direction Selina already mentioned. You talked about the mentality of experimentation, and I was wondering, when it comes to mindset and mindset shifts to bring people more towards experimentation, what is your experience how you can prepare them to deal with the outcomes of the experiments, because people getting very much attached to their ideas, and you have to bring them into the mode of accepting what the outcomes of experiments are, especially Oli just mentioned when it comes to organizational contexts. You don't have one whole semester to train them. They have to be very fast in learning that. And I was wondering what your best practices are when it comes to mindset shifts.
Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the remarkable things about design thinking has always been the diversity of mindsets that it takes to make it work. So you think of the front end of design thinking, which is all about opportunity seeking. It's about emotional engagement. It's about this intense user focus, right? And then the back end, when you get into testing, which is all about detachment from an idea rather than emotional engagement with an idea. It's about objectivity rather than immersing yourself in the subjective lived lives of other people. It's almost, you're almost asking people to do a 180-degree turn between those two sets of skills. So it really is very complex in many ways. And the whole idea of learning in action, which is the fundamental of experimentation, right? If we talk about what's the underlying skill set or what's the underlying mindset here, skill sets may be things like able to design experiments, able to, create the right kind of prototypes, able to process the results of experiment. But the mindset is the mindset shift into learning in action. The barriers to that are just significant. They're the individual barriers, and we can go back and look at Carol Dweck's mindset work with elementary school kids and evidence of a fixed mindset and what that does when you try to experiment. It explains a lot of the problems, right? We're trained from our earliest days that being smart is the same as being correct. And so to be wrong, to make a mistake, to have a failure, to conduct an experiment that doesn't go the way we want it to, is just so threatening to that kind of mindset that it's really very difficult for people to go there, right? So sometimes just building an awareness of how much our mindsets, for many of us, are geared towards being right rather than a learning mindset. Right. And how difficult it is to do this kind of work if you can't self-correct yourself out of that biased fixed mindset and into more of a learning from experience mindset, right? And then I think you add to it that organizations routinely ask people to take risks, but they don't want them to make mistakes. Right. So corporate cultures, regardless of what they say, rarely even tolerate mistakes over time. Right. So you've got this, I think, kind of double factor of individual proclivities to feel like I want to look smart, so I'm right. And then corporate cultures that make the same assumptions that managers aren't good if their experiments fail. Right. Contrast this with a venture capitalist who doesn't consider themselves a failure when the majority of their ventures that they invest in don't work, because that's the reality of the environment, right? And yet we create a very different environment in organizations, and all of that mindset is very difficult. I mean, I think that's why teaching people fast, cheap experimentation is so critical, because we're trying to keep them from investing a lot of money and looking bad when the idea turns out not to be as good as we thought it would. I mean, the safeguard against being wrong in a public, expensive way is to get good at early stage experimentation, right? And to view it as a way of managing risk. And so I think in that way, people need these tools, because we can say, look, go out and experiment, take risks. It's an uncertain world. You're going to be wrong sometimes. The reality is, unless we can create the psychological safety to know that they aren't personally going to suffer the consequences of the courageous act to kind of try and go out and actually do something, I think without the safeguard of new skills, it's going to be bad. I mean, they're not going to experiment very well, and a lot of ideas are going to fail. and particularly at the front end of design thinking, where we're using data to inspire creativity, not to test stuff. Eventually, you have to test it, right? So to have design thinking with its kind of low sample size, very rich ethnographic front end, without then actually doing some pretty good testing before you scale stuff, is asking for trouble, and it's going to impact the credibility of the work we do in design thinking, I think, if we don't help people get good at testing. But often the testing part is not fun either, right? The front end of design thinking is fun. I mean, people get engaged, they love it. It taps into a side of themselves they didn't know they have. They're all excited, and you're like, okay, now after fun for a couple of months, now we're going to get really serious and objective and critical about your idea, and it's just not much fun, you know. So it's kind of it's a much harder sell, I think, the back end of experimentation than the front end of design thinking.
Jeanne, we have four people with questions here, and the first in line here is Raluca from Romania. Actually, it reminds me, our first getting together, Jeanne, was in Romania, and
yes, it was. That's where we
Raluca
met.
is running the D school.
Yeah.
Raluca is running at Sibiu, the D school there. So Raluca, your question, remark.
Hi, nice to see you again after, I think, 5 years.
Yes,
It was
right before COVID. I always was glad we got to see the world before it shut down.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I want to tell you I have your book, Jeanne. But my question today is about if you have ever thought about doing research on how academics perceive experimentation, because in theory, that's why research, I think, the idea of testing something in a lab before you publish it, so that should be the heart, I feel, of innovation and research. But the publication time and is so long, and people fear being rejected for an article, that it feels to me, at least, that they are almost not willing to publish experiments that are going wrong. So I'm curious what your take on this is, or...
Well, we would need another whole session to begin to unpack the problems of the design of our academic universities, I think, certainly, and the tenure system and the publication system and all of that. You know, I don't think there's a group of people on the face of the earth that are more invested in being right than we are as academics, right? I mean, that's our identity is we are what we know, right? And we are experts. And so the idea of, I think, putting ourselves out there and being willing to take the chance to be wrong. And, you know, it's very hard to ask a big question these days, I think, and get published in a lot of the A journals. You know, now we're always looking at the A journals, and, you know, in part, the rigor required of the research in those publications drives out, I think, the ability to ask and research a lot of interesting questions. Because, I mean, these big questions, these big messy questions, are exploratory questions. You can't do rigorous data-based, statistically significant research on them, right? You're usually using qualitative methodologies, they're case-based, and that kind of work just, you know, perhaps the tide will turn again. It has not traditionally been very well respected by the journals in a lot of fields, right? It's why there are so few people in US business schools who are tenured faculty members whose main focus is design thinking. I had tenure before I started design thinking. So, but I'd be hard pressed to take a junior person in a business school who wanted to get tenure and say this is the way to go, right? Because even interdisciplinary research is very hard to publish in a lot of these journals, and we're nothing if not interdisciplinary. So I think there's just lots of obstacles, and, you know, we are the cobbler's children with no shoes, and we teach and tell everybody else how to do everything. And of course, we rarely practice it ourselves, right? It's kind of shocking to me when someone is astonished to learn that at the business school, we're doing things that aren't very logical, business-like, but really. So I think you've identified a much bigger issue, Raluca, with the system that we've got and how to reform it. I don't know. It's not easy, and I do feel for this current generation of junior scholars, because I don't think they would be allowed to lead the kind of academic life that I've led. Where after at the age of 50, I suddenly decided there was this new thing called design thinking that I didn't know anything about, and I didn't know how to teach. And it wasn't strategy, the field that I'd researched and published in for 30 years, but I just wanted to stop everything else I was doing and learn more about it. And I was supported in that and able to do that. I don't think that would happen today, right? So I think it's a challenging environment. And
Absolutely.
I wish there was a solution that experimentation could bring.
That is actually leading me to, there's a question in the chat here. Thank you for your presentation. It's from Ruta, and she is asking about the experimentation in the public sector, if that is possible. That's a question to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, the public sector is similar, right? We've done a lot of work on the use of design thinking in Washington, D.C. and the different federal agencies in the U.S. And again, the people drawn to the method are people who are drawn to the power of the front end of it. And people are totally under-resourced. So I think when people are under-resourced and you've hit on a solution that your heart tells you is the right one for a group of people you're serving, your inclination is always to then go to the next problem you have and the next set of people you want to serve, and not to take the time to double back and do true experimentation on the idea that you've got. There's a set of incentives that make it hard to do that. But at the scale of social institutions like that, pre-testing before implementation is so important. And it still happens. I mean, we all sat and watched when Obamacare rolled out and the computer crashed like 3 days in. I mean, it was the biggest rollout probably of a new policy in the U.S. in generations, and all of the greatest minds worked on it. They had multiple consultants lined up, and they rolled it out, and the system completely crashed. It could not in any way handle the response that it got. So the consequences of not being able to do the small scale experimentation, you think, well, really, did they think that it might have been better to roll it out like to a state maybe before starting with the entire country or things like that? But again, I think that's the difference with an experimental mentality, right? We think about how to mitigate and manage risk rather than how to rush to full-scale implementation of something. And so I think that's the mentality that goes with it as well.
Yeah, thanks. So we have 4 minutes to go, and we have 2 questions in the chat. So here in the board. David, you were next.
Fast question. Thank you, Uli, and thank you for the presentation. We're undergoing at the high school I work at some major changes, and you touched on it before. Everyone comes to the table with a mindset, and I think maybe since you have a lot of experience, how do you soften that or disengage? Do you have any special techniques or tips that you can give us that would help to open minds or make them more flexible?
I've been surprised working in the public schools at the U.S. at the amount of fear of failure. Right, I had a naive idea that it was just universities full of people who were terrified to ever do anything wrong. But as we've worked with, we have a program called Partnership for Leadership in Education here, in which we bring in principals and senior administrators from school systems around the country and teach design thinking and try and help them change, right? I mean, it's really, that's the name of the game. And it just the level of public scrutiny of teachers and of changes in the schools, I think can make it very difficult. So again, I think part of the power of the front end of design thinking is you engage, you create this immersion experience where people come to really become personally committed to changing the lived experience of someone else. And it's that switch in perspective that frees them from their own perspectives and in some way fears and stuff. I think it emboldens people and it brings people together, right? So the power of good ethnography is what softens people to change more than anything. I think it's why having someone else do your ethnography for you and come back and tell you about what they learned about the people you're trying to serve is far less successful, because it's the emotional engagement that creates the incentive to take risks and to try new things. I think it's the tools then that build a little bit of confidence that you can do this, right? And then it's the kind of community that can form when we do this together that is that additional layer of safety, right? So I think it's that kind of combination. There's no simple answer. Part of it is almost diverting people from this fear of myself and what's going to happen to me through immersion in someone else's experience. And then it's showing people a set of easy to use tools that work. I mean, one of the things I tell my students who are terrified at the beginning of the real client projects is that I've done this long enough. I can guarantee if you stay with this process and you work at it, you will produce value for someone at the end of it. It may not be the value they think they want in the beginning of the process, but they will be better off because you have worked with them. I can say that with 100% certainty because these tools work and the processes work, right? If you bring people along with you. So I think being able to offer those tools and then being able to build that trust and the community, those three things that all come from different angles, I think, tools, safety, community, caring, those all, when they come together, you need them all to make change possible in places like education, where people come in with just a huge amount of baggage about what they believe is true, right? What their own identity is. I mean, it's just, you've got to kind of pry people away from themselves and the way they see the world as a precondition to getting this work done. And what I find a lot of times is we don't want to invest in the precondition. We want to put a group of people in the room who don't trust each other, who come from very different perspectives. And we want to think that they're going to come up with some great ideas that they're all going to be willing to work on together without that investment of really identifying design criteria around a set of users that they care about, working with a set of people that they've come to trust and believe they share their commitment. You can't skip those steps and expect the magic to happen from idea generation on, I think. So the most important stuff happens before we ever start generating ideas, to me, to make change work.
Thank you so much. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. We still have the church bells here next to me tell me that the hour is over, but I know that Jeanne has some more minutes left before her next meeting. So lucky from India. I hope you're doing well in Bangalore.
Thanks.
And
Thanks, Uli.
yeah, what's your question?
Thanks, Uli. Thank you. Hi, Jeanne. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation and great content. I liked it so much. Even the one which you done some time back, I think a year or two back, I really loved it with so much of enthusiasm. I like your presentations.
Thank you.
I joined a little late today, or I think I missed the first 10 or 12 minutes. I don't know if I'm asking some questions which I may have missed out in your first few minutes. My apologies for that. Um, Based on what I heard for the rest of your presentation, it rings me a bell of the startup world. What happens in the startup world, particularly the lean startup approaches, what they use, and wherein the experimentation, the test of assumptions is pretty much common. Have you, by any chance, had a look at their practices and had a comparison with them? Because I see some similarities, and what I see here is you brought in a nice structure here. Because I have seen what the Y Combinator does it, because I was part of SAP till about a few years back. I've been a long-term, I've been a founder of SAP in India a long time back, and ended with design thinking almost for 10 years with SAP. Also been involved with the startups with SAP in India, particularly. So therefore, we work very closely with Y Combinators and Techstars. And we profess them the experimentation and the test of assumptions as one of the first things they do, because, sorry, I'm taking a little time.
Yeah,
because
no, this is helpful to understand the question.
Yeah, because in design thinking, we know that we're trying to do the problem solving and therefore the innovation comes in. However, in the startup approaches, the um, entrepreneurs, they come with their ideas and they're very passionate about their ideas, and we can't put them down saying that your idea may not work or will not work. They somehow want their ideas to work. Therefore, we bring in a roundabout approach to say that, okay, it's fine that you have your great idea. Why not you test your assumptions, right? And then bring the design thinking approaches as part of the experimentation approaches in a different manner. And then you bring in the other things. Once the experimentation process goes through, and then they do the pivoting, which we call as experimentation, and then we make the iterations and so on. They call pivoting, we call them iterations, right? And then we make it better and better. And they also make it through the experiments better and better. And then, of course, we also ask them to do the personas and so on and so forth, and everything falls in together. So therefore, my question to you is that, did you have a chance to look at them? And one thing is I liked it because of the simplicity of your structure, what you presented here.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my observation.
Well, I think people start in many different places, and in design thinking and in an ideal world, we start with the user and we start with the clean slate, right? We try and understand their needs and we build ideas out of that need. I mean, to me, that's still the right way to do it, right? But that's often not the way it gets done. I mean, in agile software development, they start with personas. Right now, I've had this argument with the people who teach agile. If you don't do research and you start by creating personas, you're just taking all of your preconceptions of your customer and putting them into a persona. All right. And then they go test them. Yes. So testing happens, but the construction comes first. And it's similar with entrepreneurs, right? They've got the idea. You can tell them they should put the idea aside and go back and just understand the customers, but they're not going to, right? They love their idea and they want to start with it. Half the time they end up back at the front end of design thinking anyway, right? But you need a failure loop first in which they realize the assumptions they're making are not correct, and then they're back where you think they should have started in the first place, right? So I suppose after all these years in the classroom, the one thing you learn is just to meet people where they are, right? And with design thinking, we know there's an ideal progression, but a lot of people, you're not going to talk them out of starting with their idea or starting with their persona. But if they do surface their assumptions and test them, there's a good chance that you'll get them back at the beginning eventually anyway. It's just a different way to get to that same part. I think I fight a lot less hard now with where people are. And that's why, I think you can almost decouple design thinking and experimentation. Right? I mean, you could just start with an idea, right? Now, after that idea doesn't work, you need some place to go for that better idea. And, you know, you're going to be back to some of our tools, but that's, you know, that's where people are ready to start, I think. And so you meet them where they are, and with the right tools where they are, you can catch them before they go too far with an idea that they know won't work. But you know, I think that's the way it is to work with most entrepreneurs, in fact, in that way. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Actually, so we are a little bit over time, but one thought, I liked Lucky, your question about the entrepreneurial activities, and I think that is the reason I love the habit in the United States that when you start a company and you want to have another investment, you have to show the investors that you at least failed twice, you know, with companies. And then, and after that, I think if you're starting the third time, you start in a different mode. Yeah, you want to learn way more and way faster about the sense of your product, for how it makes sense to the audience, to the customer, actually. And in Germany, it's still not the case, and it's still the way you have to build something which is really great and true, and then if it fails, you failed. So so I hope that will change. So thanks a lot, Jeanne, for your great talk, for your great insight. I always love to listen. We can write a book. It's just your talk again here and bring it to paper. Thanks a lot. Thanks to all of you for participating here and for giving interesting questions. And I think there are a lot more. There are great comments in the chat. And I would love to, at the end, to point on the next things. One is the next spotlight session, which will happen in May 21st. And it's a very special spotlight, I have to tell you, because it's the first time that we do a kind of gaming experience. And I would like to ask all of you who want to participate, you have to register first. Usually the GDTA Spotlight is an open session. In this case, it's a very special one, which is run by Maria Stashenko, who is directing the Design Thinking Asia activities in Kazakhstan and other countries, actually. And she designed a game. And we did a previous version already at the last conference at Penn State last year. But this is now the elaborate version, and it will be very, very interesting. So I can encourage you to take part of the Playing the Future, a Trend Watching game, and play design thinking in a gameful way in teams. So it will first time be a very interactive session. And the next thing was our conference, the GDTA conference, which will happen September 13th and 14th. Mark it in your calendars already. And the topic will be, the overarching topic will be design thinking and artificial intelligence. So who beats whom, human intelligence or artificial intelligence? We'll find out, because I think that what we are doing with design thinking, bringing teams together, we are working with the highest available version of human intelligence. And it will be very interesting how artificial intelligence can support us in our activities. So please join physically or virtually. It will be a hybrid event, September 13th and 14th. And I now officially end the session here.